Do you wanna know why Riot Forge died? Do you wanna hear Riot's MMO mentioned? Do you wanna know why all the layoffs happened? Well, all of that was just revealed in a new talk that came out about 3 weeks ago. There, as part of the 2025 DICE talks, Mark Merrill, also known as Tryndamere, talked about Riot Games and their never-ending quest to build great experiences. I know, the title sounds a bit silly, but it is an interesting look into how Riot currently operates. And as you'll see, this talk lines up with everything that is currently happening in League of Legends and beyond. On top of this, what surprised me the most is that this talk went into a lot of juicy details. And so, because you might not wanna watch the entire 30-minute talk, I'll break it down for you. So it all starts with a quick story of how Riot started. Last time Tryndamere was at DICE was back in 2008, which, just so you know, was before League even came out. Back then, Riot had about 25 people, and they all had one goal: to make something great for themselves. Because if you look around, that's how all the best projects are made. Statistically, there are simply more people that like what you like. But of course, Tryndamere also adds that they didn't wanna fail, they didn't wanna let everyone down, they didn't wanna lose their investors' money and go back to their normal jobs. So fast forward to today, and Riot quite literally changed the gaming space. But as Mark mentioned, over time the team realized that the same principles they held back then must be true today as well. Now here's the catch: these glorious principles have not always been held at Riot, there were some darker times, and we'll get to those. But regardless of their team size, be it 25 or 5,000, they had to keep the same principles true. With the first principle being, know your audience. In order to make something great, they themselves had to be immersed in their own community. And truth be told, if you look at the original team that made League of Legends, they all came from people who made the Dota mod or who were fans of the mod. So they all liked MOBAs and they just made their own MOBA. In other words, League started from the people who were just part of the community. And today, you can see the same principle reflect in something like 2XKO, where that game is absolutely focusing on the fighting game community. Now, I would argue that there has to be some leniency. For example, I would love to be part of 2XKO, but I can tell you right now, I am not really gonna enjoy the PvP parts. I would really like it if there was some kind of single-player mode. I mean, that's how I played Soul Calibur when I was a kid. I didn't have friends to play with. And look at me now, with my dyslexia, that's where my name came from. And so, if 2XKO had some kind of a story mode, I would be part of that, but then their focus wouldn't be purely on the fighting game community. And so, this is a matter of priorities. What's also cool is that you can see this principle reflecting in other game studios too. For example, the head of the Helldivers game said that a game for everyone is a game for no one. The second principle is that they have to make sure that the entire structure of their company can support the right behavior. Again, here we can definitely remember some moments where that wasn't the case at Riot, which is why they also restructured a couple of times already. With the third principle being that they have to be relentless about building great teams. Once again, there was a time where this wasn't the case, and as you'll see later, that's what eventually led into the layoffs. After which Mark mentioned that these three principles always have to stay true in order for Riot to make great things. However, that doesn't mean that these three principles guarantee a success. They only give you a chance at making something successful. And so next he went into how these principles are actually applied. Apparently, Riot Games always saw itself as a mission-driven company. It might have started with the mission of "we wanna make good games", but over time it was refined into "we aspire to make it better to be a player". Now that is a loaded thing to say, because when it comes to gameplay specifically, yes, I would argue Riot is doing that. Their games are refined and polished. Now, when it comes to what's around these games, specifically talking about monetization, yeah, I don't think you can do much there to make it better to be a player. But yes, of course, in this talk he is focusing on the gameplay and the culture. And Mark even adds, that's how Riot found their success. It was mostly the players who did all of that. And it all came out of Riot understanding their core players. It's all the people who see gaming as a lifestyle. Because these are the people that would travel across the entire world for an esports event. They are the people who craft awesome cosplays. Or the ones who put together big communities and game guides about how to be better at the game. And over time, Riot realized that if they serve these smaller niche communities really well, they respect their commitments and their time invested in the game, obvious progression jokes aside, they are the ones who spread the word about the games around. And through this kind of referral, League of Legends grew. And as was mentioned, as it grew, it could become the player's identity. Which is something that brings back quite the memories. Because back in my day, everyone always fought over what's the best game. Some people were WoW players. Some others were Call of Duty players. But eventually, people also called themselves League players. Now, over the years, this idea of only focusing on one game kinda died down. I think the last game to do this was Fortnite. But I'm not young, so I don't know what kids do these days. Do they call themselves Roblox players? Anyway, all of this only has value if the game you're making is good. Which is something Riot always looked at from 2 points of view. First of all, there is production value, or the question, how well is it made? But also there is resonance, or how well does it resonate with the targeted audience? With resonance being a massive key leading towards success, but it also brings up an interesting topic. Because once you resonate with one audience, there is the chance you are alienating everyone else. And to Riot, that's okay. That's why, for example, 2xKO might not be exactly for me because of their creative choices. Here, Tryndamere also gave us another example. Valorant is a tactical shooter that is all about buying gear, which is a genre of a specific game which we have a lot of. And so to stand out from everyone else, Riot focused on the things the community craved for. Stuff like high-tech servers, netcode, or even anti-cheat. Yes, regardless of what people think about Vanguard, you can't argue against how powerful it is. We've gone through the numbers before. Vanguard removed about 98% of all cheaters from Riot games. But all of this is still on the topic of resonance. So then comes the production value. Again, when we have a look at Valorant, according to Riot, production value was crucial. However, Tryndamere also brings up something like Balatro. Balatro didn't really have production value, but it had amazing resonance. That's how that game blew up. Which leads us into the next topic, which is Arcane. We all know the story by now. When Arcane was being pitched, it was during a time when video game adaptations were not doing well. And that's because everyone was going for mass appeal. But Arcane didn't do that. Arcane focused on the League audience first. And they believed that if the story was good enough, it would find its way out. However, if Arcane became a critically acclaimed success, but the players still didn't like it, Riot would still fail. And so instead of going to a Hollywood studio, Arcane was run by Alex and Christian, 2 Rioters who previously worked as player support. They then collaborated with a studio they worked with before, which was Fortiche, and so they took the same excitement and they pushed it all towards Arcane. Which is where we get to the big part. Because next, Tryndamere mentions that some decisions, for example the chasing of Arcane, were easier when Riot was smaller. But as companies grow, with more people, disorder and mediocrity creeps its way in. And so Riot found out that a great way to combat this is culture. Now yes, under the wrong circumstances, this may sound like Riot is becoming a cult. But thankfully, under the current circumstances, that does not seem to be the case. And so culture is of course a very difficult thing to talk about. For Riot, they want to make sure that everyone is aligned on the same mission. They want their employees to be fired up and make something cool. And the way you can achieve this, and I quote, is if the leaders walk the walk. In other words, the leaders have to be part of the company's culture themselves. The key point being that in the past there were some other companies that tried to fire up their own cultures, but with the wrong approach there are massively disastrous outcomes. One example could be Blizzard. Some of you may remember some darker times there, but of course, let's not forget that Riot also had some of these moments. And so now, Tryndamere calls the culture an invisible membrane that holds Riot games together. He even gave us an example of how it works. When the culture is strong, when something happens that would be outside of the normal scope, people tend to question it, which is good. It either leads to improvements from the teams, or it leads to individual learning. In contrast, when a company has weak culture and something abnormal happens, the employees are not gonna question it and they will just do whatever they are told to do, because they don't believe that challenging it would have any results. Now, hearing this from the head of Riot Games is interesting, because here Tryndamere told us that they want their employees to challenge their own decisions. But that, of course, is only possible if everyone is aligned in the same culture. Meaning that, again, even the leadership has to be part of it. He even adds in a quote that is pretty good.
One question that I think we all need to ask ourselves and that we ask ourselves is, are people more honest in the meeting, or are they more honest after the meeting?
After which we get to the really big part, the layoffs. Tryndamere mentions that there were times where becoming a Rioter was just awesome. Riot Games was making one really good game at the time, and as more and more people actively wanted to be part of Riot Games, Riot kinda gave in to the excitement and they kept recruiting more people. And so they get a lot of new people without even asking if they get any value from them. Even when recruiting, apparently the strategy was still to talk about their great benefits, which resulted in something interesting.
We were essentially positioning the company as Disneyland, right? Like how amazing it is to work there, and how great it is for them, rather than how important it is and how hard it is and how critical it is that we constantly strive to make things better for our audience. We lost sight of how much effort and deliberate effort it takes to keep the company focused on players, which led to lower performance and then ultimately to Riot's first big round of layoffs ever back in 2024.
And so Riot simply overhired because people wanted to work for them. And Riot wanted to be seen as one of those companies that people love. Which of course means, later people had to be let go. And Tryndamere even confirms that's what led into the big layoffs in 2024. After which we immediately go into another massive topic, which is Riot Forge. Here we start with the recap that Riot Forge was a project where Riot lended their IP to indie companies, and they allowed them to make indie games with the characters of League of Legends. But here's the new info we got. Apparently, from the beginning, the goal of Riot Forge was to acquire new players. But that's not really what happened, is it? We all know that the Forge games were amazing for all of the people who love League's universe. And we always thought that's the point of Riot Forge, to give League players something they would love, which they did. In that regard, all of the games were a massive hit. But now we've learned that was not the goal at all. It was the other way around. It was supposed to get in new players. And unfortunately, Riot Forge failed at that. Because as Tryndamere puts it, why would the players who don't know anything about League be excited to get games that tell stories from League? What's crazy is that apparently Riot knew that this would be an issue from the very beginning, but because of the size of the company, it was too slow to make any adjustments. And so while even Tryndamere admitted that these games were good, they did not align with the broad League of Legends audience, and they didn't bring in new people into League. Which again, wasn't the fault of the game developers, this was just Riot not having the culture to lead them in the right way, which resulted in Riot Forge being shut down. After which we get into a quick part where Tryndamere talks about the leadership. There he talks about all the people who are part of the gaming communities, who are also making Riot games. After which, the Riot MMO gets mentioned.
We hope to earn the opportunity to then serve this community for a long time to come. This is how Riot has and should continue to approach every new opportunity for players. Whether it's getting back to fundamentals in some of our live games that have been live for a long time, or whether it's setting our sights on new crazy ambitious challenges that we're trying to tackle, like finding ways to add value to the FGC, or even perhaps to the MMO community.
So yes, the Riot MMO is still alive, Riot is still working on it, and they are making sure it aligns with the MMO communities. And that's kinda all we learned. Which is where the talk ends. And so, to summarize the most important thing to take away from this. Should a company make something great, they should know their audience, they should serve that audience, and they shouldn't lose focus on what they wanna make. That could be why the MMO was restarted. Maybe they did lose focus and now they are making a true MMO again. And so from this entire talk, you can imagine what the comment section looks like. Riot MMO mentioned. Randomly mentioning the MMO is such a Riot Games move, to be honest. He said MMO! MMO when?